Greetings, everyone, and welcome back. It has been a week since you've seen me, since you took the exam. Today we start our second country, which is France, and in many ways, France is very, very different than England. And in a few ways, it's the same. So, if you want to follow along, this is titled "Overviews" in your lecture notes. And a couple of things. We talked about how geography really was a great blessing to Britain. The fact that it was an island gave it protection, and it's a country that hasn't been invaded for 1,000 years. France, geographically, it's kind of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, France is a larger country than England. It's about the size of Texas. Unlike England, France has 6 neighbors, which means a couple of things. One, obviously, it is vulnerable to invasions, and there have been several wars fought on French soil. World War I, World War II, the Franco-Prussian War. You may remember earlier when I talked about the Hundred Years' War between England and France. And in that particular case, that war was fought over several factors, but largely over an area of France called Gascony. So on the one hand, when France is weak, it is vulnerable to invasion from multiple quarters. On the other hand, France quite often has been quite strong. And you may remember when I talked about the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. France was the strongest European power, and that war was fought in today what would be called Germany. When Napoleon went out across Europe trying to conquer the continent, there were several different lands that he conquered, including the most powerful and famous of the German states, a place called Prussia, and he made it in Russia all the way to Moscow, although obviously with tragic results. France also has a series of rivers that allowed commerce to flow throughout the country quite easily and allowed for integration. Compare that, for example, to a country like Greece, where the country is carved up by a lot of mountains, and so people were forced to live in little valleys and were relatively isolated from one another. Geographically, France has another advantage. The weather is generally quite good, and so, for example, France is the second largest food exporter in the world because the climate is quite good for food production, for example. In fact, France is the least densely populated country in Europe. It has a population that's very, very close to that of Great Britain, around 65 million. Like England, France has a clear core, a clear center, which is the capital. And just as London is the hub of British society, so too is Paris the hub of French society. Now contrast that with the United States, where there really isn't a clear core area. Obviously the political core of the United States is Washington, D.C., but certainly if you look at finances, it isn't. New York City might be the financial center of the country. Or for entertainment, it would be the Los Angeles area. You think about Hollywood, for example, in the United States. But in both France and in England, there is a city that is the entertainment hub, the financial hub, and the political hub. In fact, probably Paris is an even greater center, as Roskin describes it, than is London, because the per capita income for people in Paris is some 60% higher than in the rest of the country. Take note, you may want to underline, I think maybe in the notes it is underlined, that Ruskin, who is a big fan of the French, so you will notice that he is much more favorably disposed to the French in this chapter than he was in Britain. He calls France the splendid hexagon, right? A country with 3 land sides and with 3 water side. So once again, the point of the hexagon was that the country is largely on a broad plain. It led to rapid communication, transportation, commerce. It also led to a very strong sense of national identity and especially economic integration. So I started off England, you may remember talking about history, that the 3 major European states, Britain, France, and Germany, all created this system called feudalism, where the monarch and the aristocrats were in kind of a balance. I mentioned that in the English case, that balance remained for several centuries. Because of France's vulnerability, especially during the 100 Years' War, and then, of course, later during the 30 Years' War, the French very, very quickly adopted that system that Ruskin calls absolutism. And Ruskin really centers on 2 monarchs, Louis XI, and of course the high water mark of absolutism in France is going to be under Louis XIV. So French kings needed troops to rely on, especially given their geographical vulnerability, and as Ruskin points out, I think oh too well, certainly that is the primary reason for French absolutism. Now the other red letter date, and we're going to spend a lot of time on this over several lectures, the red letter date is obviously the French Revolution. Up until 1789, up until the French Revolution, whether you are a fan or a foe of absolutism, French politics was very predictable. The King of France had a very compliant church in many cases. In fact, the Catholic Church reinforced the dominance of French executives, in this case French kings. I'll mention later, but I want to mention it now. Unlike England, that secularized very, very early under Henry VIII, Catholicism remains the official state religion of France until 1905. So you have a lot of continuity, but after the French Revolution, there is a fundamental split that exists in French society. You have conservatives who have this love of strong executives, and whether it is monarchies like the Bourbon Restoration, for example, whether it is a military strongman like Napoleon, or even modern conservatives who embrace the concept of a very, very strong executive under de Gaulle. In all of those cases with conservatives, you really do see this desire for strong executive leadership. On the other hand, liberals since 1789 have embraced a radical form of democracy. Not that evolutionary democracy. Remember when I talked about Britain and I talked about how democracy came very slowly, it came very evolutionary, it came in multiple reform acts. With the French, it is revolutionary democracy. They want things like proportional representation. They are not interested in political order. They are interested in political equality. Just as the conservatives embrace the notion of a strong executive, liberals are terrified of strong executives. And so they want legislative dominance and they want very, very weak executive powers. And so if you take a look on in your notes, I list what I call three very different kinds of political regimes. The first are the republics. The first four republics are republics that are generated by liberals. And you will notice that all four of these republics have tragic results. The first republic ended by a military coup. The second republic ended by a military coup. The third republic was ended by military defeat to Nazi Germany. The Fourth Republic was ended by a military uprising in Algeria. The Fifth Republic is very, very different than the first four republics. The Fifth Republic is created by a conservative, by Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was a military hero in World War II. De Gaulle was a believer first and foremost in social order and stability, and he believed that the problems with both the Third and the Fourth Republics were proportional representation, which created very unstable coalitions. Depending on which source you seek out, the Fourth Republic had 26 or 27 governments in a 12-year period. So de Gaulle created a far less democratic Fifth Republic and one with tremendous executive power. In the Fifth Republic, it is the president that is the linchpin of the political system. The National Assembly, which is the legislature in the Fifth Republic, is one of the weakest national legislatures in all of Europe, far weaker than the British House of Commons. And I will talk in great detail when I get to institutions later. You will notice the second category, the monarchies. Obviously, France was a monarchy until the French Revolution in 1789. And if you look, there were what Roskin calls three other monarchies. The constitutional monarchy that was ended by the First Republic, the Bourbon Restoration that lasted about 15 years from 1815 to 1813, and finally the Orleanist monarchy, which lasted 18 years before it was ended by the Second Republic. One of the things you should notice is that none of these governmental systems last very long. Until the Fifth Republic, the governmental system that had lasted the longest during the entire history of France since the French Revolution was the Third Republic. It was created in 1870 after a military defeat, and it ended due to a military defeat in the Second World War. The last of the regimes that I have listed is what I call Bonapartism. Obviously, Napoleon Bonaparte is the star there from 1799 to 1814, but his regime ended by military defeat. Note that Napoleon III, who was there from 1851 to 1870, notice the refrain, ended by military defeat. And then Vichy France from 1940 to 1944 ended by military defeat. I think the lesson, and the primary lesson you should get in this first overview, is remember England was blessed. It never had to create a government under the pressure of military defeat. In France, virtually every system ended or was created because of military defeat. And in the case of the Third Republic, it both started and ended due to military defeat. I will resume this lecture next.